Welcome to Origins with Dr. Natasha Wilson, where we explore the origin stories from the childhoods of leading figures in science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, also known as STEAM. Today, I will be a conversation partner with Dr. Tracy Gardner. Dr. Gardner has had an extensive career in educational measurement and psychometrics. We welcome Dr. Gardner to Origins and invite her to share with us the touch points of her childhood and early career, which has led her to where she is. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and how you grew up? Especially tell us a bit about parts of your childhood that have influenced where you are today.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here, Natasha. Thanks for having me. I grew up in the late 1970s and 1980s when computers were just sort of coming into the forefront, where families were first starting to get computers. Our first computer was a Commodore 64. And I am the daughter of a chemist, and my dad also became a statistician and a quality engineer. So I grew up in a household that loved math and science. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She was home my whole childhood, but my dad used to do all kinds of experiments at home, and he was very into bringing math into all kinds of things. So, for example, in the late 1970s, um, you may not even know this because this was before your time, but gas was very expensive, and so my dad used to keep gas mileage, and he would plot reports of how much gas mileage he was getting for his gas. So he documented all the data, and he would put it into the computer and write computer programs in BASIC to calculate gas mileage and things like that. And I was super interested in this. So he taught me how to do it. And the very first program that I wrote in BASIC was for my bowling scores. I was in a bowling league starting in 1979. And we bowled two games every Saturday. And my dad taught me how to capture the data of my bowling scores and calculate my averages over time, and then to make predictions based on how I was growing over the year, on when the likelihood would be that I would get a score of 125 or 150 out of 300. And so these are the kinds of things that my dad taught us when we were kids. I had one brother who's older, 2 years older than me, and then myself. So I had one of those very interesting childhoods where math and science was everywhere. This was during a time when a lot of girls were not encouraged to go into math and science, but my household was very different. My parents took a very big interest in my schoolwork. In fact, one time when I was in second grade, when we were learning how to do multiplication and division, I brought home a worksheet that had 7 divided by 0 on it. And as you know, that is undefined. You can't have 0 in the denominator. And my dad was the kind of dad that wrote a letter to the math teacher indicating that this math problem was incorrect and that the answer was not 0. In fact, it was undefined, and that we should, do our due diligence in teaching children about mathematics and proper mathematics. So growing up under my dad was very interesting. And my dad, actually, my mom and dad live next door to me right now. And so my parents are still very influential in my life. But my childhood was just filled with opportunities to use computers and do mathematics and all kinds of daily activities, from bowling to gas mileage to batting averages, and things like that. So I was very lucky to live in a family that was very interested in teaching both of their children about what the joys of math and science could bring to your education.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, it's just that's not very common, I think, for many households. But it's wonderful that you have that experience, and I'm certain that sparked curiosity in you, and started to kind of get the wheels turning. So it sounds like you had a pretty joyous kind of like family life. Were there times, either maybe once you started to go to school, where you maybe started not to feel like you fit in with others, maybe because of this, unique background that you had with your parents, or were there other families who were kind of like yours?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because even though my family life was very joyful, I definitely had different experiences where I didn't feel like I fit in. I grew up in a very small Italian community in Western New York, and almost everyone in my school and in my neighborhood was Italian, and most of my friends went to Catholic church, and my family was not really a church going family. I had a desire in my heart to be connected to God, but I went to church alone. My parents would drop me off, or I would go with another family. But I sort of went through this journey to find God pretty much by myself, which was really difficult as a child. So even though my family life was really good, and I really don't have any complaints about that. I just remember being on the bus or being in school, and other kids knew about Jesus, and other kids knew about the Bible and about God, and I really didn't, and so that was embarrassing to me, to be the kind of kid who didn't get to go to church on Sunday with my family. So I just decided to be bold, and I asked my parents to take me, and they did. They had no issues with taking me and picking me up or letting me go with other families. So I kind of did that on my own, which was sort of a unique, challenging experience, but it also brought me very close to God, and it brought me close to some other families, a couple of which I'm still close to today, almost 45 years later, still in contact with those families. Um, Another challenging experience I had as a child is I was one of those children that was an adult pleaser, a people pleaser, a teacher pleaser. And I worked really hard. I had a very high work ethic, and I wanted to do well. I wanted to get good grades. I wanted to, be a good student. And there were students that made fun of me for that. When our report cards would come out, I have this one memory in particular, being in sixth grade. My school was a K through six school, so we were the oldest kids in the school. And I remember some kids stealing my report card and making fun of me because I had all A's. And I didn't want people to know that I had all A's. I didn't want to be made fun of for being one of those students who actually enjoyed reading, and who wanted to do extra credit, and who wanted to do well, and who wanted to learn, and who enjoyed going to the library and doing projects and things like that. I just wanted to hide it because back in those days, and this is the early to mid 80s, it was kind of embarrassing to be a good student. It wasn't something that, a lot of students strove to be. It was more fun to be popular, or to be like the great athlete or something like that. And I just really loved learning, and wanted to be. I loved my teachers, and I wanted to please them, and I wanted to please my parents. And so, being this kid that, wanted to strive for excellence and getting good grades made me kind of the nerd and the unpopular kid that got made fun of a lot. But thankfully, because I did have a great upbringing with my parents, they were very supportive. I found a few good friends, both at school and at church. I went to church with a couple of families, as I mentioned, and also I did ballet, and so there were other students that were sort of like me in ballet. I think students that tend to do very well in music and ballet and the arts also tend to typically be relatively good students as well. There's a high correlation among those kinds of traits. So thankfully, there were some other dancers that were very similar to me that I was able to bond with. So even though I was kind of the nerdy student that kids like to make fun of, I thankfully found my little group of people, and was able to thrive within that group and not give in to the pressure that some of the other students were imposing upon me.
Oh, well, those are excellent stories of kind of, having a self-starting attitude and being able to say, this is something that I desire, I want more of in my life, and being able to bring it into your life, and also overcoming those insecurities that many of us had when we were younger, especially around being kind of the quote unquote nerd, or the not, maybe not necessarily one of the cool kids.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting, since we are interviewing people who are in science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, that it seems very early on that you were able to bring in the arts into your life through ballet. And I don't know if you maybe play an instrument or anything like that, but what role do you think your ballet had in, kind of in your growth as a woman who's also interested in mathematics and science?
Absolutely. Well, I did play an instrument. I played two instruments. I'll address that first. First, I played oboe, starting in fourth grade. I really wanted to play flute. I auditioned for the flute and the clarinet. Those were the two I wanted to play, but the instructor had me audition for oboe, and oboe is one of those instruments that has a unique reed and are very difficult to play and even more difficult to play well. And I was one of those kids that could actually play the oboe with the kind of reed that it had. So I got picked to play oboe, and I played the oboe for 2 or 3 years. But then I transitioned to play clarinet because I wanted to be in marching band, and you cannot march with an oboe because the reed is too dangerous the way it's designed. So I thankfully got the transition to clarinet. I did play first clarinet for many years, and I played clarinet all the way up through high school. So I did have a love of music as well. With respect to ballet, though, that was my real love. I ultimately had to pull away from playing clarinet after my sophomore year. I didn't have the time to practice clarinet in the way that my music teacher wanted me to when I was in ballet, because I was in ballet 6 days a week and did a lot of performances and a lot of training. And then I also helped out at the ballet school by teaching the younger students, and just there just wasn't enough time to do both. And so I transitioned away from clarinet to just solely focus on ballet. And ballet was so important for me because it gave me a way to express who I was, what I believed in, through movement. And I was actually a little bit of a shy kid. I was happy and talkative, but at the same time, given the little bit of bullying and just the way that the kids made fun of me for my grades and my academic experiences and so forth, ballet was an outlet that allowed me to build confidence by being on a stage, by being able to express myself through movement. That I think helped prepare me for my whole life. By the time I went to college, I was a ballet major for a year, and then ultimately transitioned away from it because of other things. Things around the weight requirements became very challenging for me and was beginning to affect my mental health at that point. But it set me up for everything else. It inspired work ethic in me. It taught me how to be good at managing my time and prioritizing how I wanted to live my life, where I spent my time. You have to be so disciplined to be in ballet, not only in practicing, but also in what you eat and making sure you get enough rest and making sure that you're getting your work done, and all of those kinds of things. And so by the time I got to graduate school and was working on very challenging classes and then ultimately having to defend a dissertation, I have no doubt that ballet set me up for success in those other paths just through all of the life skills that I learned in being disciplined and learning, even things like the relationship with science. Ballet is basically applied physics. You have to learn how to control your body and your energy and pushing down into the floor while lifting up at the same time, in order to have balance and to learn how to turn and to, focusing your spot. Like all of these things were physics in action. And so there are so many things about ballet that helped to prepare me for a career in math and science that, at the time I didn't really know. I didn't really see the relationships between the two. In fact, I thought it was kind of bizarre that I was a ballerina that loved math and science. But as I got older and more understood the relationships among all of those, it became clear to me that they weren't as diverse of skill sets as I thought they were when I was a child.
Oh, that is so interesting. Yeah, definitely. I can see how like you said, the discipline, the work ethic, the just again, just kind of getting the idea of the physics into your body can just
Mhm.
kind of prepare your mind to enter into into the disciplines of science and mathematics. So that was
Mhm.
really a great explanation. So I'm wondering, were there also any clues, kind of maybe touch points in your childhood that were leading you to your current career in psychometrics?
Oh my goodness, yes. When I look back over my childhood, I can see there were clues from the time I was very young. Going back to second grade, um, we were taking multiplication tests. And back then, this is 1982, and I was in Mrs. Furman's class. And if you could do your multiplication tables in a certain amount of time, you were able to have a pizza party at her house. And I really wanted to go to her house. I just thought going to Mrs. Furman's house was like, it was like meeting the president of the United States. Like, that's how important it was to me. She was such an influential teacher in my history that I wanted to do whatever it took. So that was an assessment where I just had to get very fast at doing the multiplication tables so that I could go have a pizza party at her house. So that was an assessment. That was, doing something according to, a certain set of guidelines and rules to achieve a certain score to get an outcome. So that was my first clue that I liked testing. Is I liked sort of the competition of it and what the outcome related to. Now, moving forward to eighth grade, I was taking course one, which is in New York State, that was the equivalent of Algebra 1. And the New York State Regents exams were another avenue that I just realized I loved taking Regents exams. That was my first one in eighth grade. And if you got a perfect score on that test, my teacher, Mrs. Bashaw, was going to take any of us out for a steak dinner. And again, my passion, my love for my teachers, wanting to do well and make teachers happy, I wanted to get a perfect score on that test. And I did. I got a perfect score and I was able to go out to dinner. And I was the only one that got to go with her. And that was absolutely incredible. As I moved through the Regents exams going into high school, one day I found a chemistry Regents exam preparation book in my garage, and it was from 1962, and it was my dad's. And I couldn't believe it. Even though this was almost 30 years later, it was about 28 years later that I was taking the chemistry Regents exam. It was almost the same. The test design was the same. It had multiple choice items for the first section, and then it had open-ended responses for the second section where you had to show your work and explain your answer. And you actually had some choice into which questions you got to do in section two, which I thought was a really interesting test design. It was, a way for you to show what you know on the items that you thought would best demonstrate your capabilities. And so I just love the Regents exams. They were all given at the same time in the state. If it was given at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, everyone across the whole state of New York was taking the test at the same time. And to me, there was just something really powerful about the connection of doing that together. It was kind of like a brotherhood or a sisterhood that you were all in this together. I also loved it when I got to take the SAT. I never took the ACT, but I did take the SAT, and I enjoyed it as well. I remember just the juices that flew through me on that Saturday morning when I had to show up with my number two pencils and sit for this exam and wait for my scores to come in. And I had the same exhilaration when I got to take the GRE when I was going into graduate school. So by the time I'm in college now, I'm a math and psychology double major after transitioning from ballet when I realized there was no way I was going to keep my weight at the weight they wanted me to keep it to keep performing. And I realized that the intersection of math and psychology was basically psychometrics, looking at how a mind works, how students learn, how to measure what you know. And I was just done. I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do for my life. I want to make tests. I love taking tests as a kid, and I want to make tests. And for me now as a parent, when I have 6 children, and when my kids take tests, they were indoctrinated from very young ages that taking a test is a day of celebration because you get to show what you know. And that's the good news, is that there's going to be things that you get to celebrate that you've mastered. And the other part of it, though, is there's things that you don't know, and the test helps identify what those things are. And that's great news. It's like when you're sick and you go to the doctor. The whole point of going to the doctor is to get an assessment on what do we need to do to make you better and stronger. And that's the whole point of taking tests as well. So from the time my kids were little, they learned that test day is a day of celebration because you get to show what you know, and then you get to learn about some things that you might need to do better in. And so to me, tests are not perfect, and there's been some history of tests that are maybe things that needed to get better and improve upon. But for me, getting information is helpful. That's what makes us improve. That's what gives us a way to know where our strengths are and where our areas of improvement are, so that we can keep getting better as we strive for like lifelong learning. So I knew at a very young age that testing was what I wanted to do. And I was thrilled when I got to college and figured out there was actually a career path for people who love tests and love the information that tests can provide.
That's wonderful. Could you actually give us a maybe a brief description of the field of psychometrics, maybe a definition for those who are not familiar with psychometrics?
Yeah, so psychometrics is a branch within statistics, and the goal of psychometrics is to measure what people know. Sometimes it's educational tests, sometimes it's psychological tests, sometimes it's the way that you think or the way you engage with the world. But the role of psychometrics is to measure how people think and what they know. And so it's an interaction of both statistical techniques and also content knowledge, whatever it is that you're trying to measure. So as a psychometrician, some of the things that I got to do was define the construct I wanted to measure. So if I wanted to measure what a student knows in mathematics or in reading or in grammar and writing, you define the skills that are important, and then you create test questions that will measure those specific tasks that you're trying to understand. And the process of psychometrics is collecting the evidence and then analyzing it. And ultimately, with psychometrics, you'd like to build tests that are both valid and reliable. Valid meaning that they measure what you think they're measuring, whether it's math content knowledge or reading comprehension or grammar skills. And reliable meaning that if you were to take the test again, you'd get a similar answer. And a lot of people think about reliability when they go to buy a car. I know when I was going to buy one of my first vehicles, I went to the consumer reports so I could see, what cars have high reliability ratings, meaning that they work really well for a long time. That you go into the car, you turn it on, and it's going to start. It's going to do what you want it to do. That's what reliability is, meaning that you'll get the same response every time, or a very similar response. So that's the goal of psychometrics, is to create assessments that are valid and reliable measures of the skills that you want to measure.
And why would you say that psychometrics is important? So maybe for again, kind of the layperson who's listening to this or reading this article, this interview, why would you say they should that psychometrics matters?
Yeah, because again, if we're taking the time to measure what a student knows, we want to make sure we're measuring the right thing. If we're supposed to be measuring mathematics computation skills, we want to measure those. We don't want to measure some other skill. There are some test questions, for example, where we think we're measuring the student's ability to do math computation, to add and subtract two-digit numbers with rounding or something, but instead we set the question up in such a way that the student gets the correct answer for the wrong reason. Maybe they performed a trick and it's not actually measuring math knowledge at all. It's measuring their ability to see some trick and getting the right answer. And then, reliability is important as well, because if you create test questions, but today when I take the test, I do really well, and tomorrow I take a similar test and I don't do well, then it's not reliable. You want to be able to accurately measure what students know. And so when you're looking for an assessment, you want to make sure that it's fair, that the questions measure the kinds of skills that you think they're measuring, and that it does it in a reliable way, so that the information is actually informing the teacher, the parent, the student, what it is that they're doing well in, and what they're not doing well in. And there's a lot of assessments out there, sometimes even classroom assessments that are written by teachers that aren't measuring what we think they're measuring. And there are other assessments that are done at the classroom levels that do a really great job of measuring what we think they're measuring. But that's why, as a user of test scores and test instruments, the user has a responsibility to evaluate how well does the test do what it's supposed to do, and measuring whatever it is. In fact, my younger daughter is getting her driver's permit this week, and there's an assessment that you have to take to get a driver's permit. And I would like to know that permit test actually measures her knowledge of the rules of the road, so that if she's getting a permit, that she has earned the right to be on the road, for that type of thing. Now, thankfully, you have to do more than just take a permit test. You actually have to take a performance assessment or a driver's test to show that she not only does she understand those rules in theory and what a stop sign means and what a speed limit means and what the various symbols on the road mean for changing lanes and stuff like that. It's not enough to know it conceptually to be a good driver. You have to demonstrate that you know how to do those things as well. And that's where the driver's test comes in. And that's a performance assessment against those skills that are measured in the objective assessment of getting the permit. And so as users of the information, you want to make sure that the people who are passing those assessments or taking those assessments actually have those skills. And that's why assessments are so important in many careers. I wouldn't want a doctor doing brain surgery on me if he hasn't passed the kinds of assessments, both in writing, to pass the medical boards, but also the kinds of work that he'd actually have to do with his or her own hands, in performing the surgery. Same with, people like who are flying an airplane, or, who are, representing me in the court of law. Those are all areas where certification and credentialing assessments are important to make sure that the person who's performing that particular set of tasks has the right ability to do so and has demonstrated it to an authority.
Those are all really great examples. So I'm wondering, are there some misconceptions that maybe you had before you got into the field, that, or even now in the field, that maybe other people have about psychometrics, that maybe you can kind of dispel?
Sure. Yeah, when I first became a psychometrician in 2000, so I've been doing this now for about 23 years. When I first started in my first job at Harcourt, I was 26 years old, and some of the people that I met would joke with me, and they called me terms like the psychomagician, or the psycho. Lots of interesting names that I would get, and I would ask them, why do you say that? And they said, well, Tracy, to us, psychometrics is just voodoo. As far as we know, you guys go behind some curtain, or you get in some black box and you make some numbers up and put them on a score report. And so people don't really understand that there is a set of standards that really dictate how psychometrics work. One of the key sets of standards that we follow are the standards for educational and psychological measurement, which is a joint set of standards put out by the National Council of Measurement and Education, and then also the American Psychological Corporation and the American Educational Research Association. And it's a 200-page document that basically identifies all of the standards that we should be following for fairness and validity and reliability and test use and item development and form development and reporting of scores. And so this is a manual of sorts that you can follow in order to do great work that's tied to very, very thoughtful ideals of how psychometrics should work. There's also a code of fair testing practices, and there's a code associated with just online tests alone, because they have a whole new set of issues and worries with PII, which is identifiable data, public and identifiable data about people's names and where they live, and how do you control all of that data to make sure it's in the right hands. And so there's actually a whole set of standards that you can follow. Moreover, there's an ed measurement, we call it the Ed Measurement Bible, where the field is currently working on its 5th edition. And Linda Cook, who is a measurement visionary from ETS. She's retired now, but she's actually overseeing the development of Ed Measurement 5, along with Suzanne Lane, who was my advisor at University of Pittsburgh. She's a professor at Pitt, and they are two of the editors on the Ed Measurement 5 Bible. When I was in graduate school, we were using the 3rd version of the Ed Measurement Bible, and so it's got decades of experience in there. And there's about 20 chapters in there that guides the whole industry on how to build tests and all of the things that we should be considering, from conceptualization of what the skills are all the way through scoring and reporting and getting scores on score reports. And I think most people who are not involved in psychometrics in the way that I am don't really know that all of these wonderful resources exist. And there's even organizations that have devoted their entire existence to improving practice in psychometrics. The Center for Assessment, the formal name is NCIEA, which I think stands for National Center for the Improvement in Educational Assessment, is what it stands for, but it goes by the Center for Assessment. And Scott Marion is the executive director of that organization. He's supported by Chris Domoleski. There's about 20 measurement visionaries at this group, and their whole existence is to improve educational assessment for all, to make better assessments for all kids so that we can better measure what they do. And there's other organizations that exist to do similar things. HUMRO, HUMMRO, Human Resources Research Organization is what that stands for, is another organization that's entire mission and vision is to supporting assessments. And then the Burroughs Institute actually produces a tests and measurement and a mental measurements yearbook every year that talks about all the assessments that have gone through a rigorous review process, and what assessments do what, and what are they good at, and what are some of their weaknesses. They document this every year in their books. And so for someone who feels like psychometrics is just voodoo in a box that nobody knows and nobody understands what they're doing, I feel like the field has actually done a really good job at documenting what we're doing, how we want to do it, and the standards that we're trying to live by. And so many of these documents are openly available for free use on the internet. The standards for educational and psychological measurement, you can buy a copy, or you can just get a free copy by e-copy, by ebook, that's available on the web. And so anyone who wants to learn about psychometrics, there's so many different resources and organizations that have free resources available that have pulled back the curtain, that have opened the box to show what gets us up in the morning on Monday morning when we come to work. And that's the things that give us joy and energy in trying to create assessments that are fair and valid and reliable for the purposes that they're intended to be used for.
That's a great answer. And it's also a good segue into my next question, which is what was your path into psychometrics? So, what were kind of the steps that you had to take in order to even enter the field?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate at University of Texas at San Antonio, I was a psychology and math double major. And when I was in my math classes, I got to take statistics classes from the math department and also from the School of Engineering. I took all my calculus sequence from the engineering department. And I just thought it was so fantastic because in the psychology department, while we did have a test and measurements class and we did have a stats class, it didn't really go into the same level of rigor and the same level of sort of abstract statistics that the engineering school and the math school did. And so I was working with my professor, and I just told him how much I loved taking these classes from the math department, from the math stats department. And he was the one who told me about psychometrics. And there was a couple of different avenues. There's quantitative psychology is one area. And then measurement and psychometrics is kind of the other area. And he helped me identify a few different schools to look into. So I applied to Purdue, University of Chicago, and Pitt were the three main schools I was looking at. There was a couple others that I was looking at as well. But University of Iowa is one of the best graduate schools for psychometrics in the country, but I just didn't want to live in a small town. I didn't want to go to Iowa. I wanted to be in a city. So Chicago and Pittsburgh were two that I was very interested in. And I ultimately ended up at Pitt because for two reasons. One, Wei Xing Tang was a graduate of Pitt who is currently living in San Antonio at the time. This was 1995. And I had the opportunity to meet with him and ask him about his journey into psychometrics. And that personal story of connecting with him really turned me on to investigating Pitt a little more closely. And then secondly, when I went to interview at Pitt, I was supposed to stay at Dr. Tony Nitko's house. He was the chair of the department, but he was undergoing renovations in his house at the time. So they had me stay with Dr. Suzanne Lane. who just by chance had just had a baby 6 months ago. And to me, I was 21 years old at the time, and to see this female professor with a new baby who was living her dream of being in academia and having a baby was just it. I was like, I'm sold. This is where I want to come. It's in a great city. There's a female professor who I see myself in. She's doing the kind of work I want to do. She was working on the Maryland State Performance Assessment Program, which was very innovative for the time. It was a cross-disciplinary assessment that went across math, science, social studies, and language arts. And students got to have manipulatives, and they got to work on group projects, and they wrote, and they edited each other's work, and they did class presentations, and it was so innovative and project based that I was just like, this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I probably would have worked on performance assessments exclusively my whole career if I would have had the chance. But as luck would have it, in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed unanimously, I think, across both parties. I think there was unanimous support for it. And that brought testing into the forefront for all children. And it had to be objective, it had to be valid, reliable. Scores had to come out very quickly so that it could inform instruction. And so that's when testing really took off as an accountability measure. And that's when performance assessments kind of had to go away for a while, because performance assessments have a very, very different purpose than high stakes accountability testing that came out of the No Child Left Behind Act. But there was so many different pathways across my college and graduate school life that just like let me know time after time that this is what I want to do and this is how I want to do it.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so as you were kind of moving through your career, can you think of maybe a few highlights from your career and also maybe a few challenging times in your career and maybe give us a description of how you overcame some of those challenges?
Sure. Some of my favorite highlights were working directly with teachers. I was that psychometrician who saw getting the data back from test scores as like Christmas morning to me, because we worked with content folks and editorial staff and program managers and project directors on developing great assessments. But until the scores would actually come back, you really didn't know how you had done. So when the scores would come in the spring, during the spring equating season, which is when we made sure that the scores were valid and reliable and the forms were parallel in terms of difficulty. That was like Christmas morning to a psychometrician. And after those results would come in, then it was time to have a whole host of meetings with teachers across the summer. So for items that had been field tested, we would go in front of teachers and we would share the data on how students performed. So we would show them data on what percentage of students got the item right. And for students that didn't get it right, what answer did they pick? And did the item differentiate well between students who scored high on the test and students who scored low? Because items should discriminate well, meaning that if you know the construct well, you should have a better chance of getting the question right than if you don't know how to do that particular skill it's measuring. So those are my absolute favorite meetings. I got to do about 50 of those meetings in the state of Texas alone. My first couple of years, I spent the whole summer in Austin working with teachers and helping them understand the data. Over the course of my first decade in psychometrics, I got to either facilitate, run, or lead 34 different standard setting meetings. And those are the meetings where you establish the cut score for what does it mean to be proficient, or what does it mean to be advanced or below basic, or any of the particular levels that we worked on. And I found that work to be particularly inspiring to me, because being in front of the teachers was my favorite thing ever. Another favorite opportunity was to be the senior director of assessment for the GED program. Up through 2014, the GED assessment was typically seen as a minimal competency test, and it didn't really carry a lot of power. If you passed the GED, there was a point in time where people would say, well, who cares? It's a minimum competency test. What does that actually mean? What can you actually do if you pass the GED? And we had a goal to radically change what it meant to have a GED credential. And so we raised the standards, we aligned it to the Common Core state standards, and We required that students be able to read complex texts, primary sources, the Great American Conversation, to read the kinds of texts that matter, the kinds of texts that define an educated citizenry. And then we wanted them to be able to reason. We wanted them to be able to look at the text and be able to evaluate when a good argument was made versus when a bad argument was made. We required students to create arguments, to write an essay that showed an argument, that had evidence from the text to support their answer, and to do it with solid grammar and development of ideas. So we really wanted to raise the bar of what the GED credential meant, and that was definitely a highlight of my career. And then finally, in my current role at CLT, to develop a new set of assessments that is geared to grades 3 through 6, that put great literature in front of children, that allowed them to read some primary text, but to also read wonderful stories of virtue, that put ideas in front of kids that they had to think about, that taught them a lesson, and also to put history and science in front of students that allowed them to learn something new and put that into action, and to test their mathematical abilities to solve logic problems and do abstract reasoning. That was definitely a big highlight of my career, to work with such an amazing team at putting together a product that served a set of kids who were getting a knowledge-rich curriculum, sometimes a religious education, sometimes a homeschooling education, but nevertheless, students who were receiving a knowledge-rich curriculum that was based on tradition. Definitely a highlight of my career to help build that assessment at CLT.
Oh, that's great. And have you experienced any challenges that throughout your career, and especially those that you were able to overcome, and maybe kind of have some lessons that you could share with our audience?
Yes, I think one of the hardest challenges for me was learning how to balance a career with being a wife and a mother. I have 6 children, and the children that I have are completely amazing, and I really love spending time with them and doing the kinds of things that any mother wants to do: reading to their children, going to their game, being home at night, putting them to bed, having dinner with them, hearing their stories, going to their school events. And those are the things I think that every mother wants to do with their children. But I also wanted to be excellent at my work. I wanted to do the kind of work that achieved results. And I wanted to build my teams in such ways that we could overcome obstacles and trust one another and debate ideas. And in order to be an excellent leader, you've got to be there for the teams that you work with. And every crisis doesn't happen from 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. Sometimes you have to solve crises over the weekend or overnight and things like that. And so I think the biggest challenge for me in my work was finding a balance where I could still be a great leader, and be a leader of leaders and build strong teams that were dedicated to the work and who knew how they contributed to the work, and doing work that gave them joy and energy, sort of finding the right people to serve in the right seats, while also being able to unplug myself from that work, so that when I was home with my children, that I could have dinner with them and talk about their day and read great books with them, and talk about how those books impact them, and having a prayer life with our kids, and a daily prayer life, because I remembered what it was like as a kid to be sort of faithful alone without the support of a family, to help me through it. And I wanted to be there for my own kids and to support them and hear their fears. And so those were some challenges. I had babies at a time where there were no places to, pump your milk at work. You had to go into a bathroom stall, and, I traveled a lot, and I had to, bring my backpack with me so that, I could pump milk while I was away. And I didn't really always have female leaders that I could turn to and ask, how do you do this? How do you be a mom and, be a leader, be a worker at the same time? And so I've tried to be that particularly to young women, young moms who are trying to navigate that. But I've also tried to be an inspiration to men and women of all different walks of life, who there's all kinds of people who have experienced their own trouble spots in their career, and having nobody to believe in them, or nobody to support them, or nobody to help them figure out how to navigate this complex thing we call life, and get the good life towards human flourishing. So I've tried to give back, and I would love to be able to, in my lifetime, establish a scholarship under my family name of Gardner, to represent kids who didn't have the kind of dad that I did, that was, supporting me to love math and science. And just because I was a girl, like, you're not going to be able to do math. Like, a lot of girls I knew, that's what they were told. And I wasn't told that. I was told that you can do anything you put your mind to. And not everybody has that. So if I could establish a scholarship and help identify some of those kids in the community that didn't have that, and take them under my wing, take them under the wing of my husband, take them under the wing of my own children, who had every privilege before them as children. And I want them to be able to give back to the community, to give back to the churches that they serve in, and the schools, particularly the inner city schools in the beautiful city of San Antonio that I live in. I would love to be able to do that, because I figured a few things out along the way by myself, but I also had a lot of people pulling for me. And I think one of the things that I've learned in adulthood is that it's okay to ask for help. I never was one to ask for help. I wanted to just figure out how to do it myself, and I figured that was the only way to be successful, is just to do everything myself. And now, as an almost 50-year-old woman, I realize that you're not going to get as far as you can go if you do everything yourself. There's a lot of people that are willing and able to help you, and it's okay to ask for help. In fact, it's a strength to be able to do that. And I want to be able to give back to those kids and those young people who don't know that yet. If I can be a glimmer of hope to them, and introduce them to some ideas of things that I've learned along the way, and some leadership principles, some ways to cope with stress, and how to keep persevering with grit through it all. If I can be a source of inspiration to some, then at the end of my life, my legacy will have been made.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and we definitely support your efforts to have such a scholarship and have such a mentoring role. It's definitely needed at this time. So I have a few just kind of random questions to ask you, just to kind of get to know you more as a person.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, do you have any favorite authors or favorite book?
I do. My favorite authors, I'm going to admit, they're all nonfiction, and they're all in the leadership development realm. When I get free time to read, anytime Patrick Lencioni comes out with a new book, it's going to be the first book that I both purchase and hard copy and get via Audible, because I'm the kind of learner that I like to hear it and see it and touch it. So if I really like a book, I get both the Audible version and the hard written copy version, so that I can sort of learn it from a variety of different perspectives. So Patrick Lencioni is definitely my favorite. Gino Wickman is another. He is the author of the Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS, and he has just such a great set of tools that teaches leaders how to establish a great strategy in their vision, how to get the right people on the bus and the right seats, how to set up your scorecard that you're measuring what matters, how to set up effective meetings so that you're actually accomplishing the things in meetings that you're trying to do, and basically how to establish traction for getting your business off the ground. So I really love his work. My husband is former military. He was in the 82nd Airborne, so I tremendously value military leaders. My favorite military leader is Jocko Willink. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he has an organization called Echelon Front. And he writes all about leadership that he learned on the battlefield. And the way that he writes is he presents it in context from the battlefield, but then he translates that specific principle into how it manifests itself in the boardroom or in the workplace. So I really love his work as well. And then I'll finish with one more. Jim Collins is another business leader that I really love, and he really touches the heartstrings for me. Because he's not only a business leader, but he's a scientist. He's a data guy. He loves setting up sort of experimental designs or quasi experimental designs. And he, in his book Good to Great, he set up um, a strategy to study organizations that met certain criteria over a 15-year period that took them from good to great. And so he set it up as a research study, and then he studied what was similar and different about companies that became great versus companies with similar backgrounds and similar industries, similar size, similar financial metrics, and why they didn't become great. And so, given my background, my PhD's in research methodology, so given my background in research and my passion for business excellence and execution, he's another one of my favorites. So those are the kinds of books that I love to read. I'm always reading a business book, at least one, if not two at the same time. And then I would say from the kind of books I love to read with my kids, I love reading Virtue. And one of my favorites is the Book of Virtues by William Bennett. He's the editor of this book, and it's a collection of stories that teaches on a whole collection of stories across time. And he's the former education secretary under Ronald Reagan. And this type of book, I think, has been very influential to my husband and I in raising our children, because not only are you reading great stories, but you're learning about virtue, you're learning about persistence and truth and honesty and courage and determination, and a whole collection of things that we're trying to instill in our children. And reading those kinds of things together has been just the absolute most joyous part of my motherhood. I think when I read with my children, we never get to do it enough, but every day or almost every day when we do read together, I can say with honor that those are the best moments of my day, because that is how legacy is passed down. That is how information and leadership is passed down to the next generation. And I'm hoping that through those interactions with my kids, I'm creating the kind of human beings that will do the same with their own kids and continue to pass down a legacy to their own children and their communities as they grow up as well.
You, I mean, that's pretty amazing with such a prolific career that you're also able to do so much with your children and with your family in terms of just developing your six children and maintaining your household. So that's just it's really wonderful to hear that, and for you to be able to share kind of how you've been able to accomplish that with other um, young women who might be also starting out their career and starting out their family. So that's really inspiring.
Thank you.
Um, so I'm just wondering, as we kind of wrap up, who else might you recommend that we speak to?
So I would recommend the next person to speak to is someone who I value very deeply. He was a colleague of mine, and now I consider him a friend. His name is Dr. Quentin Love, and he is a psychometrician at Wested. He has a very, very interesting past. He has motivated me and inspired me. I was a leader to him, but he's a leader to me as well. And I've learned so much from him about psychometrics, but I've also learned about faith. I've learned about how to better lead my family and how to be a good friend. And he is a man of courage. He is a man of integrity, and it has been he's been one of my favorite people that I've met in my career journey as a psychometrician, and I would highly recommend that you reach out to Dr. Quentin Love and interview him next for your next podcast. I think it would be something that would tremendously benefit you as an African American woman. He's an African American man. His journey is inspiring. His journey is full of pain, but his journey is full of love and hope. And I know that he would inspire many young men who are crippled with anger and with sadness and sorrow. And to see what Quentin has done for his life, as a psychometrician, as a husband, as a father, as a son. I think he will inspire many. So I highly recommend you reach out to him next.
Thank you so much. And he has a great last name. So it'll be wonderful to see how love has kind of pervaded his whole life, you know. So this next question was actually inspired by another podcast that I listen to here and there called The Diary of a CEO. And so at the end of every podcast, he asks, and hopefully he doesn't mind that I use this. What question would you like us to ask the next person that we interview?
That's such a great question. Um, I think you should ask him, um, what was it about his childhood that convinced him that a different kind of life was possible for him?
That's a great question. Thank you.
Mhm.
And as one final question is, if you could write a book about a well-known person in STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics, who would it be about?
It would actually be about a collection of women from the 1960s called the NASA computers. These were human computers. They were a group of African American women who were human computation experts who helped to get the first mission to the moon accomplished. Their names are, I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Dorothy Vaughan. There's a movie about them that I saw. I have goosebumps right now as I think about it. I saw the movie once, and now every time I see it, when I'm flipping the channels or when I'm on an airplane and I'm flipping through to see what I want to watch, when I see that movie's on, I just have to watch it because they are the most inspirational women that I can think of that I've ever heard of, and what they did for our country at a time when it was so divided, and they helped make the mission to the moon something we could accomplish. Without them, we wouldn't have gotten there. So I would love to see many more books written about these amazing women who changed mathematics and science for women forever, and particularly women of color forever.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here at Origins. Your story has been just great, inspiring, and it's just been great also just to learn more about the field of psychometrics. I don't think that many people have heard of the field of psychometrics, and you've been a prolific leader in psychometrics, especially with your work on the new GED, and then currently working with lower grade assessments and knowledge rich curriculum. And so we're just really happy to have you here and thank you for interviewing with us.
Thank you, Natasha. It's been my delight and privilege to be here with you today.
Thank you for joining us on Origins with myself, Dr. Natasha Wilson. We hope that you will join us again. You can find us at www.originsconvo.com, as well as on Twitter and Instagram using the handle at OriginsConvo. Please join our Substack at originsconvo.substack.com, where we will post interviews and other interesting content for both free and paid subscribers. Thank you.